Main title: The Boring History for Sleep. Why the First Pocket Watch Ticked in a Minor Key Story. 1. The Clockmakers Whisper. How a Swiss village spent 50 years perfecting the pocket watch. You are sitting in a quiet room. Maybe the light is a little dim. There's the faint sound of ticking, soft, deliberate, and not quite in tune. You can almost imagine an old man in the corner, hunched over a workbench, lifting a tiny gear no larger than a lentil with a pair of brass tweezers. This is not the tale of a brilliant invention striking the world like lightning. No, this is the gentle drift of time through a place where time itself was being tamed. A sleepy town tucked into the Jura Mountains of Switzerland. The story begins in the late 16th century, not with a bang, but with a whir. In the small town of Les Local, people had two passions: making things with their hands and keeping quiet while doing it. The snowy winters kept folks indoors, and Protestant values encouraged a kind of quiet diligence. As farming slowed during the long alpine winters, something curious began to happen. Artisans turned their attention to making watches, not big ones, not even particularly accurate ones at first, but small, intricate, stubbornly ticking ones. Before the idea of a pocket watch really took hold, watches were more like wearable clocks, heavy, pendant-sized objects, often engraved and ornate, but about as reliable as a rooster on vacation. The Swiss, however, didn't mind that. What they did mind, very quietly, of course, was that the Germans were making better gears. The French had prettier enamel, so the Swiss began a slow, steady project of incremental improvements. Gears were ground smoother, springs were coiled tighter, cases were filed thinner. And in the town of La Local, one family began to ask a very curious question: what note should a watch tick in? The Monnier family wasn't famous. They didn't invent anything earth-shattering, but they were deeply committed to the idea that sound mattered. You see, most watches ticked in whatever tone their mechanism happened to produce. Some high and annoying, like a bee trapped in a jar. Others dull and clunky. But the Moyniers noticed that people seemed to relax more when a certain kind of ticking occurred, a mellow, almost musical tick that reminded them of lullabies or the rhythm of walking through leaves. So they began tuning their watches. Yes, tuning, like tiny instruments. They weren't musicians, but they consulted with a local church organist. They tested different alloys for the escape wheel and balance spring, trying to make a softer, deeper tick. Eventually, they discovered that by adjusting the length of the hairspring and slightly altering the depth of the gear teeth, they could coax the ticking mechanism into producing a sound that roughly corresponded to a note in the minor key. .ya. No one really knows. Some say it was because it reminded them of the tone the local bell made during funerals. Others say it matched the wind's tone when it curled around the mountain in late October. Either way, the watches the Moyniers produced had a ticking sound that was neither too high nor too cheerful. It was calming. Their customers noticed. Not right away, but over time. Your watches are gentler. One letter read, "My husband sleeps better when it's on the nightstand," wrote another. It wasn't scientific. It wasn't even intentional at first. But slowly, these minor key watches began to sell more than others, especially among the clergy, the widowed, and the quietly anxious. The Moyniers, of course, never claimed to be marketing geniuses. They just wanted to make something beautiful. But this attention to sound, to texture, to boring precision turned them into unlikely pioneers. Their methods spread first to nearby workshops, then across the valley, then to Geneva. But all of this was happening during a time when Europe was not particularly calm. The late 1500s were full of religious conflict, shifting monarchies, and maritime adventures that went horribly wrong. Against that backdrop, the Moyniers' quiet workshop stood like a soft heartbeat in a chaotic body. Now you picture the watches of that era. You probably imagine something intricate and dazzling, maybe covered in gold filigree, but not the Moynier watches. No, theirs were plain, brushed brass or dull silver. They believed that the decoration should not distract from the sound. Even the faces were understated black numerals on a cream dial. A single hand ticking steadily, mournfully, in minor key. Their tuning methods weren't widely understood. Other watchmakers dismissed it as superstition or snobbery, but the locals knew. You could tell a Moynier watch by ear. In a tavern, if someone pulled out a ticking timepiece that made you feel like sighing gently for no particular reason, chances were good it came from La Loco. And then came the letter that changed everything. A Dutch merchant named Willem van Tassen, who traded in spices and leather between Amsterdam and Zurich, wrote a peculiar request. He wanted a dozen watches identical in size, shape, and most importantly, in sound. He claimed he could sell them in the East Indies, where quietness is prized more than cleverness. The Moyniers were skeptical. Who would want 12 watches that sounded the same? But work was work, and they accepted. That winter, they labored, by lamplight, to match the tone of each watch. Every night, they held them up to their ears, tapping, resetting, listening again. Each piece had to tick not just in A, but in exactly the same A. They enlisted the church organist again to verify pitch. They even measured the decibels using a water glass, noting how the ripple patterns shifted with louder ticks. It was all very boring and very beautiful. By spring, the watches were ready. Willem returned, paid handsomely, and disappeared off to Java or Malacca. No one knows. But within a year, letters returned. One from a Javanese noble thanking the Moineers for 12 sleeping companions. Another from a French translator who said he used the ticking to calm his nerves before negotiations. And that's when the Moineers realized they had done something strange. Something not quite mechanical, not quite musical. They had built peace into a pocket. What made people sleep better while listening to a watch tick in a minor key? Was it the predictability, the low tone, or something older, something more primal? Did the Moineers, in their sleepy Swiss workshop, stumble upon a kind of mechanical lullaby? You wake again in the imaginary workshop, where the light slants low through leaded glass, and everything smells faintly of brass shavings and melted beeswax. The ticking continues soft, steady, a heartbeat wrapped in metal. But now, the story becomes more intricate, like a gear sliding into place. This is the part where the quiet idea of the Moineers begins to drift beyond their sleepy village end cities, into salons, into empires. After the Javanese noble's thank you letter arrived, the Moineer family didn't suddenly become wealthy or famous. That's not how these things happened. What changed was subtler an increase in demand that came not from nobles or kings, but from librarians, abbots, and physicians, the kinds of people who understood silence as a companion by the early 17th century. The Moineer workshop employed 3 apprentices, not sons. Interestingly, but local girls trained in embroidery. They had steady hands and patient minds, ideal for the fine-tuning of watch innards. Their names are not preserved in gilded texts, but from old receipts and a crumbling payroll ledger, we know them as in Lucille and Beatrix. Together, they spent most of the year listening, literally. One tuned, another timed, and a third judged whether a watch passed the nap test. Could you fall asleep beside it? It may seem strange now, but back then, there was little separation between engineering and craft. The line between clockmaker and poet was blurrier than you'd think. And this idea, that time itself could have tone, slowly filtered out of the Jura Mountains and into other corners of Europe. Enter Dr. Salvatore Bencini, an Italian physician with an unusual problem. His patients couldn't sleep. His little clinic in Lucca specialized in what was then called melancholia of the waking type. Today, we might call it anxiety or insomnia. But in 1624, Bencini was more concerned with balance for humors. of the moon, and of the nervous spirits. Bencini had acquired one of the Moynier watches through a Jesuit intermediary and noticed something odd. Patients who kept the watch nearby ticked, ticking gently fell asleep faster. Not all, but many. Enough for him to write a letter to a journal of useful medical curiosities published in Venice. It was a quiet letter, just a few hundred words, but it made its way, eventually, to the hands of an eccentric horologist in Prague, Jan Bodonik. Bodonik was no Moynier. He liked his clocks loud, baroque, and covered in angels. But the idea of a tuned watch fascinated him. Could sound actually regulate the human body? He decided to test it with monks at the Strav monastery. Bodonik provided 5 watches. Each ticked in a different key, crafted in cooperation with several Czech watchmakers. Over the course of weeks, the monks rotated watches and kept logs. How they felt, how quickly they fell asleep, and most amusingly, how deeply they dreamed. The results, though hardly scientific, showed one clear pattern. The minor key watches, especially those in A and C minor, produced the most restful nights. Not thrilling dreams, but calm ones. Recurring themes included slow walks through fields, reading books by candlelight, or listening to rainfall. The monastery study gained modest attention in Jesuit circles and among the quieter branches of Europe's medical societies. The Moyniers, still tucked into their Alpine workshop, never published anything, but orders increased. More customers began requesting low-tone watches or quiet tick varieties. The Moyniers never advertise. They didn't need to. Their watches traveled by whispered dot. Now, the broader world of watchmaking at the time was changing too. Huguenot refugees from France brought new techniques to Geneva. The British, meanwhile, were experimenting with balance spring improvements and escape mechanisms that greatly improved accuracy. These were flashier, more technical evolutions. And yet, the Moynier watches held their own, not because they kept better time, but because they kept softer time. One anecdote found in the memoirs of an obscure Dutch botanist named Peter van Slooten offers a delightful glimpse into this odd little phenomenon. In 1649, Van Slooten traveled to Suriname to study tropical plant life. On the voyage, he shared a cabin with a German merchant who snored violently. Peter couldn't sleep in till the merchant lent him a watch to place on the WINDOW SILL. Van Slooten writes, "The sound of it, low and regular, was like having a cat purring on the other side of a curtain. I found it lulled my thoughts into the same rhythm. For the first time in days, I slept deeply and dreamt of growing vines that curled around the stars." Not exactly peer-reviewed, but memorable nonetheless. Now, by this point, other makers had begun trying to replicate the Moinier's tuning. But here's the catch: it wasn't easy. The specific alloy they used for the hairspring was a local mixture, part copper, part tin, and a trace of some unnamed or found only in a nearby hill, now lost to history. The temperature of the forge, the length of the coil, even the shape of the inner claspball of it influenced the final sound. It wasn't enough to copy the design. You had to listen. And most makers didn't have the patience. Back in La Local, the Moiniers had refined their tuning process into a kind of ritual. Each watch was placed on a velvet cloth inside a wooden box. One person would listen through a brass cone. Another would compare the sound against a tuning fork, handmade, slightly warped, but consistent. If the pitch wavered too far in either direction, the entire escapement was disassembled and redone. It was the kind of perfectionism no one paid extra for. And yet, it quietly created one of the first recognizable brands of watch, not through logos, through sound, and perhaps that's the part that feels most unusual today. In our world of beeps, buzzes, and digital timers, the idea of tuning a device to be less noticeable feels almost rebellious. The Moiniers weren't trying to draw attention. They were trying to vanish into your life like background music. You only notice when it's gone. But time, as always, moved on. By the late 1600s, other makers had caught up in both accuracy and design. The Moiniers kept their loyal customers, but never expanded. They declined investment offers, turned down royal commissions. They simply kept making quiet watches in a quiet village. And yet, despite their obscurity, fragments of their influence can still be heard if you know where to listen. A museum curator in Vienna once compared the tick of a Moinier pocket watch to a lullaby sung through gears. A sleep clinic in Zurich keeps one on display, though it no longer ticks. And some say the A-tick inspired early metronome makers when setting default tempos for nocturnes and adagios. There's no surviving patent, no famous portrait, just a fading list of orders and one handwritten note, signed by Anne, the apprentice. In 1643, today, all four watched past the nap test. The room was very quiet. I nearly fell asleep myself. Was that the height of their innovation? Making time so peaceful you drift off while measuring it? Or was it something deeper? Something that reminded people in a world of war and noise that time didn't always have to march. It could meander. It could whisper. The sound returns, now not loud, not demanding. Just that steady, breath-like tick in a minor key. It's been with you through the slow unveiling of a forgotten village, a quiet family, and a peculiar pursuit, not of accuracy, fame, or fortune, but of peace. We've heard the story of how one small community built a watch that sounded like rest itself. Now, we arrive at the quiet end of this winding path by the early 18th century. The world of timekeeping had become noticeably louder. Precision was in vogue. Cities across Europe competed to build the most accurate clocks. Pendulum mechanisms improved. Escapements were redesigned, and pocket watches became slimmer, more ornate, more competitive. Kings wanted them. Merchants traded them. And more, time was treated not as a companion, but as a resource, something to track, to spend, to control. The moineers, tucked into their workshop in the local, did not change. Their watches still ticked in a minor key, still passed the nap test, still featured dull silver cases and brass balance wheels shaped with hand files passed down for generations. But the world began to pass them by. Geneva watchmakers began advertising scientifically tuned tick rates. English horologists boasted the ticking precision of a soldier's step, and soon a ticking pocket watch was no longer a soft presence. It was a symbol of command, of commerce, of being awake. The moineers never caught up. But perhaps that was the point. A traveler named Monsieur Bellamy visited the local in 1711 and left behind a short journal now archived in Lausanne. He described the village as eerily still and the moinier workshop as like stepping into the quietest hour of your life. He bought a watch. He asked why the ticking was so low. One of the younger moiniers, possibly Jacques, a great-grandson of the founder, replied, "Loud watches are for loud lives. Ours are for those who'd rather not be interrupted." At this point in history, a strange thing began to happen. The moiniers' reputation, while fading among nobles and collectors, began to grow in a very different group. Archivists, yes, archivists. Librarians, cloistered scholars, music copyists, people whose lives were built around quietness. Circles that moinier watches could be used in libraries without disturbing study, that their ticking was mellow enough to blend into breath, but clear enough to count. One Danish philosopher, named in his notes, claimed he wrote entire treatises by matching his heartbeat to a moinier tick. But fame wasn't what the moiniers wanted. In fact, records show that they never expanded production beyond a few dozen watches a year. They rejected requests for catalogs. They refused to adopt louder escapements or cheaper alloys. And when a Prussian official tried to commission 500 sleep watches for a military hospital in Berlin, they politely declined with a one-sentence letter: "We are not a factory." Eventually, time began to forget them. By the 1760s, only one moinier workshop remained. run by an aging watchmaker named Elise Moynier, great-granddaughter of the original founder. She kept no apprentices, issued no invoices, and gave away most of her watches in exchange for wool, candles, or stories. An English tourist named William Croft visited her during his walking tour of Switzerland in 1769. In his diary, he wrote, "She offered me a cup of warm milk and handed me a ticking watch. It was not for sale. She told me to hold it while we spoke. I cannot recall our conversation, but I remember that tick-like footsteps receding into a dream." Elise died in 1772. With her, the Moynier tradition vanished. No one took up the mantle. The tools were sold, scattered, or melted down. The workshop itself was later converted into a goat shed, then demolished during a road expansion in the 1890s. No blue plaque marks the spot. No monument was erected, and yet some of their watches survived. Today, perhaps a dozen genuine Moynier timepieces are known to exist. Most are held in private collections or museums, not for their precision or luxury, but for their sound. Curators wear cotton gloves and hold the watches up to microphones in soundproof booths. Recordings have been made. And remarkably, even after centuries, many still tick quietly, mournfully, in A. The British Museum holds one. The Museum of Horology in La Chaux-de-Fonds has another. The third, it resides, oddly enough, in a sleep therapy clinic in Kyoto. It is kept in a sealed glass dome and wound once a month by a technician wearing a lab coat and headphones. One of the most remarkable stories comes from 2009, when a sound engineer named Elodie Hirschman digitally analyzed the tick of a Moynier watch during a study of audio environments used to aid sleep. Her report, published quietly in a Scandinavian journal, noted something strange. The watch's tick had a spectral profile nearly identical to a natural resting heart rate. Specifically, a heart at rest under the influence of deep meditation. Coincidence? Likely. But she added this note: there is a gentleness to the sound that suggests the maker cared not for attention, but for harmony. It is, for lack of a better word, considerate. And maybe that's what the Moynier watches really were. Not precise, not powerful, but considerate. They considered the person listening. They considered that life might sometimes be too loud. They considered that time didn't have to shout unso. They whispered. A Moynier pocket watch does not tell you what to do. It does not bark alarms or command punctuality. It does not measure efficiency. It does not dazzle with jewels. It simply ticks in a tone that makes you want to exhale, to rest, to listen. Perhaps that is why long after factories replaced workshops, and courts replaced gears, and screens replaced faces, some part of us still longs for the quiet tick of time in a minor key. Why do we find comfort in that lonely A? Why do our bodies respond to a sound barely louder than breath? Why does the slow, soft tick of a forgotten watch make us feel more present, more grounded, more still? Maybe it's not about timekeeping at all. Maybe it's about remembering that time, when treated gently, will treat us gently in return. Picture a large, creaking table made from oak. Upon it lies a vellum sheet, half drawn with careful lines of blue ink and green watercolor. There are tiny islands no one has visited yet. There are coastlines that end in a vague smudge. And near the edge, just near the Tropic of Capricorn, there's a suspicious little blotch in the ocean, dark and ringed in faint brown. It almost looks like a tea stain. You wouldn't be wrong in the quiet world of a 17th century European cartography. The edges of maps weren't always blank. Sometimes they held dragons, yes, but more often they held human error, smudges, guesses, and the occasional trace of someone's lunge. But in one sleepy room in Amsterdam, a particularly slow and meticulous mapmaker had a habit of letting his tea cool directly over the South Pacific. His name was Frederick Van Dornick, and he wasn't particularly famous. He didn't discover anything. He didn't travel. He didn't name continents. He just copied. For 42 years, he sat in the back room of the Dutch East India Company's chart house, carefully reproducing shipping maps by hand, slowly, painfully, with great care, and with many, many cups of tea. Frederick was born in 1619 in a canal-side neighborhood near the Westerkerk in Amsterdam. His father was a barrel cooper, his mother a midwife. He showed little interest in either trade, but at age 14, he was apprenticed to a map colorer person whose job was to gently add watercolor to black and white engravings. These were not flamboyant maps. They were working documents charts used by VOC, Verenigd Oostendisch Company ships navigating to Batavia, Java, the Cape, and beyond. The maps had to be accurate, but above all, they had to survive. They were rolled, folded, soaked, and scuffed by sailors who knew more about wind than ink. Frederick, however, approached them with monk-like patience. He worked under candlelight and windows smeared with canal condensation. His tools were few: a feather quill, a set of brushes made from squirrel hair, 2 small dishes of pigment, and a tin mug of strong black tea boiled with ginger and left to sit. He believed the bitter scent helped him focus, and over time, the mug became a fixture of the workspace. So did the stains. You see, the workroom was small, and the maps were large. To reach across them, Frederick would often rest the tea on corners he hadn't yet colored. In theory, he moved it before the steam caused damage. In practice, he sometimes forgot, especially during the afternoons, especially near the South Pacific. Now, one might ask, wasn't he fired? After all, these were maps used for maritime trade, worth millions of guilders. But the truth is, most of the tea stains were so faint and so regularly shaped that they blended into the parchment. And more curiously, Van Doornik had developed the habit of integrating the marks into the geography itself. A faint ring became a reef. A small blot was labeled possible shoals, cited 1624. A pew, a beach near New Guinea became breakers, unconfirmed. It wasn't deception exactly, more like gentle improvisation. After all, the Pacific was vast and mysterious, and, frankly, not very interesting to most of Frederick's superiors unless it contained spice islands or gold. If a circular stain appeared near Tahiti and was labeled uncharted atoll, who would know otherwise? More than once, ship captains traced their routes using Van Doornik's charts and simply assumed these phantom features were accurate. In many cases, they didn't go far enough south to check. The Pacific, at this time, was known but not known. Even as Abel Tasman charted part of Australia and New Zealand, much of the Southern Ocean was still guesswork. Cartographers filled in the gaps with whispers, copied each other's guesses, and occasionally added polite disclaimers like, "Here be uncertainty." Frederick, by contrast, treated the unknown with indifference, not fear, not ambition, just the same shrugging calm with which he sipped his tea and added one more ring of warm vapor to the map margins. Over time, other map makers noticed not the stains themselves, but the peculiar frequency of circular island groups labeled only in faint ink. Some suspected Frederick was being overly cautious. Others accused him of laziness. A few even believed he was referencing older Portuguese charts that had long since vanished. No one, to our knowledge, guessed the truth that these ghostly landforms were the result of damp, mugs, and absent dash-mindedness. But Frederick didn't mind. In fact, he seemed to lean into the ambiguity. His later maps often included small notes in the margins like details, approximate, accuracy, pending return voyage. Or, more cryptically, what is drawn may yet be found. And while it's tempting to see this as poetic, perhaps even philosophical, there's a simpler explanation. Frederick Van Doornik was just very tired. He was not paid well. His fingers were permanently ink-stained, and he lived alone above a cheese shop. His only regular company was his sister's cat, who visited once a week and occasionally walked across a drying map, leaving behind faint paw prints, some of which were later misread as shoals by distant explorers. Still, he kept going, map after map, tea after tea, ocean after ocean. By the time he turned 60, Frederick had contributed to over 300 hand-drawn maps. Most are anonymous and signed, uncelebrated. If you look closely in certain maritime archives in Rotterdam or Jakarta, you may find one. And if you do, scan the southern oceans. Look just below the equator. Tilt the page in the light. Might see it, a faint, uneven ring, slightly browner than the ink, smudged at the edge. Ladrones do sud. It might say, unconfirmed, seen from distance, 1681. Of course, no ship ever confirmed them. No expedition found reefs where his maps suggested. But no one complained either. In many ways, his imagined geography matched the mood of the sea, uncertain, slow, quietly, unbothered. By fact, it leaves us wondering how many features on old maps were real, how many were guesses, and how many were the result of something as ordinary and as comfortingly boring as a cooling cup of tea. If you find yourself drifting again, eyes half-lidded, the image of tea rings floating on parchment, then you're right where you should be. Because this part of the story slows even further. It's not about discovery or daring voyages, but about the gentle rhythm of repetition, about how one man's habit of placing his mug in the same place every afternoon came to quietly rewrite the boundaries of the known world. After decades of steady work, Frederick van Doornik's peculiar additions began to take on a curious life of their own. Not because anyone celebrated them, but because no one questioned them. In the vast bureaucratic machine of the Dutch East India Company, VOC, where records were copied, passed, lost, and refiled across oceans and continents, even the faintest mark could take on a strange permanence. Frederick was not the only cartographer working for the VOC, of course. In fact, by the 1670s, the company employed over 40 map copyists in various branches from Amsterdam to Batavia. But unlike many of them ambitious men who angled for fame or royal commissions, Frederick did not seek promotion. He remained in the same windowless room, drinking the same bitter tea, tracing the same loops and contours with the same slightly crooked quill. And yet, it was his maps that slowly filtered into long-term use. Why? Because Frederick was reliable. Not accurate, necessarily, but reliable in the way a ticking clock might be, even if it's 5 minutes slow. His charts were legible, neatly labeled, carefully inked, and most importantly, he never fell behind on deadlines. Supervisors appreciated that, and so, without anyone meaning to, the versions he copied became the versions that were copied again, then engraved, then distributed, then translated into Portuguese and French, then included in compilations. And so it was that faint, imagined islands initially drawn around a tea ring or a brush smear were copied and recopied until they became familiar to sailors who had never seen them. Cartographers began to refer to these ghosts with casual terms: the Dornick Reefs, Frederick's Atolls, or simply that fuzzy chain west of Tonga. None of these names appeared on the maps themselves, of course, but in margins, in letters, in conversations among bored cabin boys and aging captains. There is a particularly telling entry from the logbook of the Swan, a VOC frigate sailing in 1694 passed through calm waters under low moon. Officer checked Dornick's chart, cited nothing but the sky, said he preferred it that way. It's a small note, easy to overlook, but it says something deeper about the nature of exploration. In the late 17th century, not every voyage sought to confirm new lands. Some were content simply not to collide with anything. In that sense, Frederick's vague blobs, his gentle ghosts, were ideal. They suggested something might be there, but didn't demand confirmation. And what of Frederick himself? By all accounts, he never sought attention. His personal letters, few as they are, contain no ambition, no boast, just inquiries about the price of ink, requests for quieter neighbors, and frequent apologies for smudging drafts during humid weather. One particularly sleepy letter to his sister includes the line, "The new parchment curls slightly in the corners. I placed my tea on it to calm it." Comments on a shipment of charts received in 1682. "Your last batch, as ever, arrived on time." One map bore a curious stain, which we've labeled unreliable. Bang seems to suit it. The captain approves. This blending of error and geography, of human routine with imagined terrain, continued unnoticed for years. But in 1701, something unexpected occurred. A French cartographer named Abbé de Lambre published a map based entirely on copies of VOC charts, including many of Frederick's. De Lambre, being a man of precision, decided to correct the vague outlines and add Latin names where none existed. And so, a brownish tea stain on one of Frederick's South Pacific maps became Insula Fiducia, the island of trust. Another faint ellipse became Archipelagus Remisses, the relaxed archipelago. De Lambre was not mocking the charts. Quite the opposite. He simply assumed these soft, blurry marks were based on some real, if poorly documented, sighting. After all, no one would invent such dull islands by choice, would they? The names stuck for a brief moment in the early 18th century. Several European maps featured a peaceful cluster of islands south of Fiji labeled as Remissus. A few even added topographical features: low hills, mossy trees, native fishing villages, unverified. These details, of course, were pure fiction built upon fiction, anchored in the tiniest reality, the circular base of a ginger-steeped mug. And then came the explorers, or rather, then came the people sent to confirm that the islands didn't exist. By 1710, the VOC had grown more demanding of map accuracy. Competition with the British and French spurred a crackdown on outdated charts. Survey ships were dispatched to verify old entries, especially those deemed uncertain. One such mission, led by Captain Cornelis Blazeweek aboard the Sheld, targeted the so-called relaxed archipelago. Blazeweek's logs were unusually poetic for a sea captain. In one entry, he wrote, "We sailed into stillness, water without wrinkle, sky without threat. No land appeared. They found nothing, of course. No reef, no sandbar, not even driftwood. Just the gentle expanse of the Pacific, indifferent to all mistakes." But rather than delete the islands from his chart, Blazeweek added a note: "No land found, but the map brings comfort. Let it remain comfort." That's what Frederick had offered, without ever intending to. A comfort born not of certainty, but of softness, not of conquest, but of quiet. And so, even after official maps began to omit remisses, some sailors carried their old charts with them, not for navigation, but because, in their own words, they liked the look of the water better when something friendly waited in it. There's something deeply human in that, a kind of sleepy hopefulness. The idea that in the vast unknown, even the faintest blot might be a place to rest, a place to imagine, a place perhaps to dream. It brings us back to Frederick himself, now older, slower, still in that back room above the canal. His tea cooler now, his hands more unsteady. She was not very good at it. As a result, the tea stains grew a little bolder. Some became full ovals, filled in later with a dry brush and labeled low-lying sand. Others were outlined with dotted lines and marked with Latin phrases like dubium loxat, doubtful place. But by then, no one truly minded. Frederick died in the winter of 1707, aged 88. He left no heirs, no estate, just A cupboard of brushes, 2 broken compasses, and 1 tea-stained globe, finished, but beautiful in its way. A slow swirl of oceans, broken only by soft brown rings. Was this cartographer's life wasted on guesswork? Did the world lose anything by trusting a man who sometimes mistook accidents for archipelagos? Or did it gain something quieter? Reminder that not every blank space needs to be filled, and precisely some can be softened with the warmth of a mug and left open for the imagination to explore. The world always forgets the slow ones first. History, for all its scrolls and ledgers, is biased toward, speed toward, those who arrive first, who speak loudest, who claim what others only suspected. And yet, the ones who moved slowly, who paused, who drifted, who set their tea down in the same corner of the table day after day sometimes leave marks that last. Longest dot, such was the case with Frederick van Doornik. He did not blaze trails across oceans or redraw empires. He did not argue in court or sign decrees. He simply sat, day after day, in a narrow room above a canal, copying maps, carefully, sleepily, with occasional stains and long sighs. And strangely, this is exactly why he matters. Let's look, briefly, at what followed by the early 18th century as Frederick's ghostly atolls faded from official maps. A new generation of cartographers took over. These were men with sharper lines and stronger ink. They prized clarity. They sent surveyors to the Arctic and the Amazon. They used sextants and chronometers and newfangled triangulation techniques. In their minds, every shape on a chart had to be verifiable. Anything uncertain was erased, labeled error, or replaced by a grid. The oceans began to empty not of water, but of mystery. One famous example, in 1753, a British naval officer named Sir Arthur Hanley ordered the removal of over 30 phantom islands from the Admiralty's master chart. He called them fancies left by lazy Dutchmen and replaced them with blank sea. Blank, clean, and deef. We're honest a little boring. But not everyone was convinced this was progress. Among a small circle of philosophical geographers, yes, that was a thing, there arose a minor rebellion. They believed that maps should not merely reflect confirmed data, but also the texture of human knowledge, the mistakes, the hopes, the poetic guesses. One of these was Madame Lucienne Dufresne, a French map theorist writing in 1781. In her book, Contours of the Uncertain, she argued that, quote, even errors deserve a place, for they remind us that maps are not mirrors, but diaries. Dufresne cited Frederick van Doornik, directly calling his maps sleepy, honest reflections of a world still half unknown. She even owned a copy of his chart of the South Pacific, now browned and cracked at the edges, but with one particularly well-preserved T-ring near the Marquesas. She displayed it not for its accuracy, but for its ambience. That word, ambience, crops up again a century later, in a very different setting, in 1883. A small exhibit in Vienna, titled The Cartographer's Mind, featured instruments, drafts, and maps from forgotten corners of the profession. Among the maps was one listed as unconfirmed South Sea copy, attributed to F. van Doornik, c. 1680. Visitors described the map as strangely calming, mildly warm in tone, and more dream than diagram. One critic, writing for the local paper, said, "It contains nothing urgent. A chart for drifting, not arriving." That line became something of a motto among map collectors, sleep researchers, and even a few ambient musicians in the late 20th century. Yes, truly, in 1994, a Japanese composer named Keiko Arakawa released a minimalist piano album titled Faint Archipelagos. The cover featured a recreated map by Van Doornik, complete with sepia stains. Each song was named after one of his fictitious islands. The compositions were slow, repetitive, and deeply calming, each piece built around a four-note phrase meant to evoke the drip of cooling tea. The album sold modestly, but in sleep therapy clinics from Kyoto to Montreal, it became a quiet fixture played in rooms with dim lights and soft chairs, where insomniacs tried to remember how to rest. Arakawa later admitted she hadn't originally believed the islands were fake. They sounded too gentle to be invented, she said, and maybe that's the heart of it. Frederick's work endures not because it was precise, but because it was gentle. His maps didn't insist, they suggested. They didn't instruct, they whispered. They offered the dream of land where none was proven, and in doing so, they honored something most maps forget: the human longing, not just to know, but to imagine. Let us return now, one last time, to that quiet room in Amsterdam. It's late in the afternoon. The light filters through grime-smudged glass. The cat has curled up on a folded map near Madagascar. Frederick leans forward, ink-stained fingers resting on the paper. His tea, now cold, sits just below the line labeled Tropicos Capricornus. He breathes. He draws. The mug leaves a ring. He notices but does not move it. Later, when the map is nearly finished, he turns that ring into a suggestion: atoll group, unconfirmed. And then, perhaps with a faint smile, he adds one last word in the margin: peaceful, not accurate, not final. But, like everything he touched, just quiet enough to endure. So, next time you glance at an old map, especially one with smudges and ambiguities, ask yourself, was it error? Was it laziness? Or was it a sleepwalker's gift left not to guide you, but to let you rest along the way? Story 3. Boring Greek Myths for Sleep. Why Poseidon got jealous of a horse and built a salt fountain. Let's settle into the soft folds of time, not in the noisy clamor of Olympus, but somewhere slower, perhaps under the warm shade of an olive tree, where the myths drift more like clouds than thunderbolts. This is not the story of gods clashing in the sky, but of one sea god and a horse, or, more precisely, a god who wished he had invented the horse, and instead ended up making a rather awkward salt fountain. You've likely heard of Poseidon, trident in hand, ocean in his beard, god of the sea, earthquakes, and somewhat oddly horses. Yes, horses. The Greeks called him Hippios, in certain regions, the horse lord. But the reason behind that title is murky, dull, and oddly delightful when you slow it down. Our story begins not on the sea, but in a committee meeting, not a divine war council, not a festival, a municipal decision. The gods were divvying up cities. Athena wanted one. So did Poseidon, the city in question. Athens, now we're used to gods battling over love and power, but in this case, they were competing in what you might call a gift-off. Each god would present the citizens of the city with a gift. Whichever gift was deemed more useful or impressive would win them the city. It was a bit like Olympian Idol, but with less singing and more magic. Poseidon went first. He stepped forward, lifted his trident, and with no lack of flair struck the rocky hilltop with its polished tines. From the cracked ground sprang forth a fountain. Now, fountains are lovely, refreshing, full of promise. Except this one. Well, it sprayed seawater, salt water, in a city with no coastline. The spectators were polite. They clapped a little. Someone may have mumbled, "Nice shimmer." But truthfully, it wasn't a hit. Especially not when they tried to drink from it. The briny splash did have a bit of flair. Seahorses apparently leaped through the jets. But salt water is not what a dry hillside settlement wants, especially when they're farming barley. Poseidon seemed pleased anyway. He probably imagined it would become a sort of centerpiece, a gathering place, a monument, perhaps even a wishing well for sailors. Maybe he thought it would echo the strength of the sea. But in practice, it just stung people's eyes. Athena's turn followed. She did something far less flashy. Deal. she planted an olive seed in the soil, and so, the myth goes, it immediately grew into a full tree, with fruit, shade, bark, wood, all quietly and modestly useful. The people didn't cheer, they just nodded. Thoughtful, practical, the olive tree, unlike the salt fountain, could feed them, could light lamps, could give oil for cooking, for rituals, for cleaning, could be carved into tools, furniture, offerings. It was a clear victory. Athena won. The city was named Athens. The fountain became a sort of background feature, gurgling quietly in the corner of the Acropolis, mostly ignored. And Poseidon, he was not pleased, but he didn't rage. Not immediately. He sulked. Now, here's where the myth usually stops in textbooks. Athena wins, Poseidon pouts. End of story. But what happens next is where our sleepy myth truly begins. Because Poseidon didn't forget the salt fountain or the horse. Yes, the horse, you see. In another version of the tale, perhaps told by shepherds instead of scholars, Poseidon didn't just make a salt fountain. In some older accounts, his first gift attempt was something else entirely. A horse, not a war horse. Not a steed for charging into battle, but a wild, silken-maned creature that thundered across the hillsides. According to this version, Poseidon sculpted it out of sea foam and wind. He shaped it from waves and breath, and the people marveled at it. The problem: horses weren't especially useful to Athenians at the time. They were expensive, prone to running off, hard to feed in rocky terrain. In fact, early Athens was built for goats, not galloping, so the citizens, while impressed, still chose the olive tree and the salt fountain that came second, a sort of backup gift, one he summoned in frustration and kept bubbling on the Acropolis as a reminder that he had tried, he had made something grand, something dramatic. Imagine now Poseidon back in his palace beneath the waves, pacing among coral columns, his hair drifting in slow motion, muttering, perhaps, about olives and ungrateful villagers. He could shake the earth, drown fleets, stir up whales, but he couldn't win a simple civic vote. So, Poseidon did what many of us do when feeling overlooked. He leaned harder into his niche. He embraced the one part of the story that was noticed: the horse. From that day on, he claimed horses as his own, sculpted them in sea caves, bred sea stallions with foamy manes, taught charioteers to swear his name before races. He commissioned statues of himself riding golden horses that galloped across the sea. You may have seen them: Poseidon with windswept beard, trident in one hand, reins in the other, waves crashing beneath. It was branding, really. If he couldn't have Athens, he'd have Thessaly. If not philosophers, then cavalry. and the salt fountain. It remained on the Acropolis, still there, supposedly, trickling gently for centuries, dry most of the year. A whisper from the god who lost the vote, the poet Pausanias, writing centuries later, described it like this: there stands a fissure from which water may sometimes be drawn. It tastes of the sea. The Athenians say it is the breath of Poseidon sulking, but no one ever blocked it up. No one filled it with earth. They left it alone, not out of reverence exactly, more out of habit, tradition, the way you might leave an odd old statue standing in a corner, even if no one remembers why it's there. Maybe that's how myths survive, not as blaring horns, but as background noises, salt fountains, windy hooves, breath, echoing through marble cracks. So what does it mean that Poseidon, god of tempests and tridents, once competed with a goddess of wisdom and lost to an olive tree? What does it tell us that his second best offering, his salty little fountain, still trickled long after the temple bells fell silent? And why, in a myth that begins with grand gifts, does the most enduring object end up being the least useful? Perhaps the answer lies not in the outcome, but in the persistence. Perhaps Poseidon didn't want to win the city as much as he wanted to be remembered there. The myths always favor the winners. Athena, wise and composed, with her spear and owl and neatly armored intellect, usually gets the closing word. But if you stand very quietly on the Acropolis on a windy day, just beyond the Parthenon, near the old Erechtheion shrine, there's a spot where the marble is worn smooth. There's a hollow sound beneath the stone, a wet sort of echo. That's where Poseidon left his mark. The salt spring is still there, they say, or rather, the memory of it. Most days, it's a cracked little basin with no glamour. But sometimes, when the sea winds blow in from Piraeus and rattle the pines just right, there's a hush of dampness. Not a fountain, but a breath, a sigh of brine. Tour guides rarely point it out. Scholars call it symbolic, but perhaps it is something simpler: Poseidon's attempt to stay relevant, to keep dripping even after being voted second place. You see, the salt fountain wasn't a mistake. It was a gesture, maybe even a stubborn joke, a final passive-aggressive reminder that while Athena gave them olives, he gave them water. Unusable, yes, but still dramatic, still elemental, still a god's gift. And over the centuries, the story of Poseidon's fountain grew stranger in some tellings. The fountain didn't just appear with a crack of the trident sang. The ear, a long, salty note, somewhere between a hiss and a hum. Old priests at the Erechtheion claimed they could hear it shift with the tides, even though the sea was miles away. They said the water rose on stormy nights. They said it curled like mist around sleeping guards. They said it once spat out a fish. None of these tales made it into Hesiod or Homer. Too boring, perhaps too local. But in the quieter corners of Athens, especially among older citizens who had no use for war stories, the salt spring became a favorite curiosity. Children were told not to drink from it unless they wanted to sneeze for a week. Potters claimed it rusted their tools. A sculptor once insisted his chisels grew dull if left nearby overnight. Some said the fountain held Poseidon's mood in on grumpy days. It smelled strongly of seaweed and dead oysters, and yet it stayed for centuries. While temples fell and names changed and statues cracked, the little spring remained tucked in its corner of the Acropolis. Not glorious, not sacred, just ... damp. Occasionally, now. Let's return to the horse. If the fountain was Poseidon's grumpy monument, then the horse was his long revenge. Because after losing the city, Poseidon didn't rage outwardly. He didn't smite Athens much. Instead, he began a very slow campaign of association. He would become the god of horses, not just in legend, but in iconography, in temple statues, koi, in myths whispered across every hillside stable in Thessaly. Charioteers painted waves on their wheels. In Corinth, horse breeders left offerings of sea. Salt before races. In the rural Peloponnese, farmers told stories of Poseidon galloping across fields on white horses made of mist. The hooves didn't touch the ground. They left dew instead of prints. A sleepy myth from Boeotia claimed that Poseidon's horses could trot across oceans. They didn't run, they glided. As though the waves were silk and the air was heavy with quiet. One older farmer name, forgotten, was said to have seen one such creature at dusk. Drinking from an inland spring, it looked at him, nodded once, and vanished. He spoke of it only once, and only to his mule, who didn't care. The funny thing is, horses weren't originally part of Poseidon's domain. He was a sea god, an earth shaker. His original worship centered on storms and tremors. Earthquakes were his language, but the horse that was imported later, possibly borrowed from older sky gods or fertility spirits, possibly invented during a lull in worship when priests needed to make his image more palatable to land dwellers. But Poseidon took it seriously. He embraced the horse like a shy man adopts a stray cat, cautiously, completely, with a sort of unspoken need to be seen in a new light. You can see it in the art. Earlier statues show him bearded and stern, holding the trident, waves curling at his feet. Later images add horses beside him, curled and rearing, manes flowing like kelp. By the Hellenistic period, Poseidon is often shown riding a sea chariot pulled by Hippocamp's half-horse. Half-fish. He had made them his. Scholars sometimes call this a domain expansion, but it reads more like mythological rebranding. If he couldn't have the olive tree, he would have the olive grove's plow horse. If he couldn't rule the city, he'd rule the countryside beyond it. He didn't erase Athena's victory. He just took the long way around it. One particularly dull but charming inscription from a 3rd century BCE farmhouse in Attica reads, "To Poseidon Hippios, may our mare birth twins this spring." It's a prayer, a quiet one, practical, earthy, it suggests. Not wrath or worship, but a kind of neighborly respect. The same kind you might give to a salty old man who never moved away after losing the town council vote. And isn't that what Poseidon became in this version of the story? Not the wrathful god with crashing waves and quaking earth, but the stubborn one, the persistent one, the god who stayed, who left a wet patch on the hilltop, and who eventually convinced the whole region to name their best horses in his honor. He didn't rage, he simply waited. Now we arrive at a curious question. Why did the Greeks, so practical in many things, let this story live? Why keep the salt fountain? Why let a second-place god rebrand himself as a patron of creatures he never originally owned? Why let a myth grow slowly, sideways, into corners that no one watches? Maybe the answer is this. Some myths aren't meant to teach or impress. Some are meant to soothe. Maybe the salt fountain wasn't a monument, but a reminder that even gods can be humbled, that even dramatic gifts can fall flat, that even powerful beings can try too hard and then quietly reinvent themselves in more useful forms. As we ease into the closing chapter of Poseidon's quietly petulant myth, it's worth noting how myths, like saltwater, often seep into cracks. We didn't expect, by now you know the story well. A god loses a contest, his fountain is rejected, his horse is admired but passed over. And so he lingers, not in glory, but in grudging persistence. Not in temples, but in springs. Not in triumphant songs, but in hoofbeats and half-remembered names. It would be easy to leave the tale there, but the myths did over the centuries. Poseidon's quiet sulk at Athens became a sort of running joke among poets, stonemasons, and priests who had grown tired of stories with thunder and blood. For them, the salt fountain was relatable, a little disappointing, a little silly, and, in its own odd way, deeply comforting. Here was a god who didn't storm off. He just stayed awkwardly nearby. There are even later myths rarely told in schoolbooks that suggest Poseidon visited the Acropolis from time to time, not in fury, but with mild curiosity. One version says he disguised himself as a wandering fisherman and sat beside the fountain for an entire afternoon. When a curious boy asked if the water could be drunk, Poseidon said no, but handed him a small fish to cheer him up. Another tells of a cloudy morning when a priest found fresh seaweed coiled in the fountain basin, despite no rainfall and no tide. He claimed to hear soft hoofbeats retreating into the marble dot. No one believed him, of course. The olive tree, Athena gifted, practical, productive, was copied and replanted across Greece. It fed and warmed the people. It gave oil for light and leaves for wreaths and branches for peace. But the salt fountain, it gave nothing, and somehow it remained, perhaps because it made no demands, perhaps because it had no lesson to teach, perhaps because, deep down, even the Athenians recognized something familiar in its the faint sting of trying your best and failing anyway. Let's shift, just for a moment, to the horse again, because while Poseidon did not win Athens, he did win the long game. Elsewhere, by the Roman period, he had merged with Neptune, and his chariots, pulled by hippocamps, were all but standard. Racing stables built altars to him. Sailors who kept horses aboard, yes. There were those left dried sea salt beneath the feed trough in Delphi. A now lost hymn included the line, Poseidon of hoof and horn, of crest and wave, come steady our wheels. That's not a call for storms. That's not about tridents. That's a prayer for smooth travel, for a cooperation, for someone to keep the wheels turning quietly, without flare, without crashing by the 1st century BCE. An Athenian playwright named Philostrates wrote a minor comedy called The God with the Second Best Gift. It told the story of Poseidon entering a godly gift competition, losing, then spending the rest of the play trying to start a horse racing club. The joke: every time he tries to explain his salt fountain, the other characters interrupt him. Audiences loved it. Wasn't epic. It wasn't tragic, but it was familiar. The idea that even a god could feel overshadowed in, yet still find his little corner of the world. To be useful in is a deeply human sort of myth. And so we come to the final echo of this sleepy tale. It is said that in very old Athens, once a year on the festival of Panathenea, citizens would decorate both Athena's olive tree and Poseidon's fountain. Not equally, not ceremonially, but just as a courtesy. A small garland of sea lavender might be placed near the fissure. Someone would pour a bit of fresh water into it, not because it needed it, but to cool the salt, as if saying, "You're still here. We remember." There was even a short phrase children whispered when passing the spot: "Don't step in the puddle." Poseidon's watching, was he? Probably not. But if he was, if he still lingered in sea spray and stubborn puddles, he would likely appreciate the gesture, not grand, not victorious, just a little moment of acknowledgement. So, what can we take from Poseidon's salty legacy? Not just the drama of the contest, not just the invention of the horse, but the way a forgotten feature wanted, unsipped, uncelebrated, became a permanent part of a city's story. Not because it worked, not because it won, but because it stayed. And maybe, in your own quiet hours, you've had your salt fountain moments, the effort that didn't impress, the gift that wasn't chosen, the quiet persistence in being remembered, not as the best, but as the still there. If so, perhaps Poseidon would nod in understanding. He might not offer thunder, but he might let the wind carry a whinny across the hills, a soft, dimmed thank you from a god who built a fountain of seawater on a dry hill, still found a way to become part of the myth. Story 4, History Podcast for Sleep: Why Korean Scholars Carried Folding Desks and Tea Sets. Let's step softly now into a slower world, one where time was measured not by clanging bells or roaring crowds, but by the steeping of tea leaves, the brush of ink on paper, and the folding of wooden legs beneath a scholar's portable desk. We are in Korea, specifically the Joseon dynasty, a long, deeply Confucian period stretching from the late 14th century into the 19th, a time when rulers were expected to read, when officials were expected to write, and when true respectability was not proven with swords or wealth, but with a neat brushstroke and a quiet demeanor. If you were a young bana, member of the literati classure, real tools weren't spears or banners. They were bamboo pens, silk robes, scrolls of commentary on long-dead philosophers, and, oddly enough, a folding desk, small, wooden, elegant, portable, known as a soban to the modern eye. The soban looks like a tray table for a child or a minimalist serving board, but for the Korean scholar of the Joseon era, it was everything: a desk, a lunch table, a tea stage, a symbol of decorum, and often, though no one said it aloud, a personal barrier between oneself and the unpredictable terrain of the wider world. These desks weren't factory-made. They were hand-carved from Zalkova, Polonia, or pine. They often had delicate cut-out legs that could be folded flat and carried under one arm. Some had curved edges to prevent ink bottles or cups from slipping off. Some had slots carved in for brushes and rulers. Others had nothing at all, just a flat, worn surface that bore the faint gloss of generations of fingers tapping, tracing, pausing. The scholar's desk was, above all, personal, and along with the desk came another essential: the tea set, not grand, not ornate. Often just a small clay teapot and one or two shallow cups stored in a padded case of hemp or silk. Because what use is reflection, after all, without tea? Picture now a quiet hill just outside a provincial Korean town, perhaps in the 17th century. It's late morning. The sun filters through pine needles. A cicada drones lazily. A man, maybe 25, maybe 50, sits cross-legged on a woven mat. Before him is his soban. To his right, a ceramic teapot is nestled beside a folded cloth. His robe is loose. His hair is tied back in a scholar's knot, held with a narrow pin. He's not teaching. He's not writing a treatise. He's simply copying, slowly, meditatively, excerpt from the Analects of Confucius. Every few lines, he pauses, takes a sip of lukewarm tea, looks at the trees, brushes a bit of dust from the desk. Surface then continues to the outside observer. It might look like he's wasting time, but for the Hossen scholar, this was time well spent. Self-cultivation, mental refinement, quiet endurance. A scholar's virtue, you see, was not just tested in exams or offices. It was shaped in these moments of stillness under trees, in the corners of gardens, beside stone walls, where vines crept and birds chirped. The folding desk allowed him to bring order wherever he went. A tiny, disciplined square of civilization. In a chaotic world, why were they so devoted to these desks? It wasn't just convenience, it was Confucianism. The entire Hossen state was steeped in Neo-Confucian ideology, imported from China, but carefully adapted to Korean sensibilities. To be a scholar wasn't just a job, it was a sacred duty. Were a moral anchor, a reader of classics, a steady presence in uncertain times, and that meant being prepared always, wherever you were. A folding desk allowed you to compose a letter on the road, to translate a line of Mencius beside a stream, to draft an elegy for a village elder without needing a full library around you. It was, in a sense, a way of carrying a piece of your study with you, a portable sanctum, a mini refuge of order and etiquette. The tea set completed the picture. Tea wasn't consumed for energy or habit or even hydration. It was symbolic. To drink tea while writing meant you were working from a place of clarity. It meant you weren't driven by impulse or hunger or distraction. It was calm ambition. Many scholars practiced chadu, the way of tea, not as a social ritual, but as a personal philosophy. The quiet brewing of leaves, the gentle cooling of the pot, the raising of the cup without splash or noise. It was all part of the cultivation of self. If a man could serve himself tea without disturbing the desk, without spilling on the scroll, and without rushing a single step, he was considered trustworthy, even if he never raised his voice, even if he failed the state exam, even if he never wrote anything grand. He had comportment. The folding desk and tea set became so embedded in Korean scholar life that they show up everywhere, in paintings usually small and brown, off to the side under a flowering tree, in poetry often mentioned in passing, as though the desk is a silent companion, and in burial tombs where miniature versions were placed beside the deceased, not as decoration, but as eternal study tools. You might not need gold in the afterlife. Surely you would need a place to set your inkstone. One famous Confucian official, Yi Wang, known by his pen name Togyo, said to have refused large desks in government offices. He preferred his soben even in court. He claimed it kept his mind closer to the ground. Big desks, he said, invite big mistakes. There's something very sleepy about all this, not boring exactly, but measured, slow, ritualized. A scholar might spend an entire afternoon drafting a 2-paragraph memorial to a distant cousin, or hours arranging 3 cups in a perfect triangle before pouring. They would rewrite lines, pause to check tone, sip again, and look at the clouds. They believed that a single good sentence was worth more than 100 rushed ones. So the folding desk light, narrow, weathered, was not just a piece of furniture. It was a partner in the lifelong pursuit of doing things properly, even in the mountains, even on the roadside, even when no one was watching. So here we are. Centuries later, no cicadas, no robes, no Confucian exam boards waiting with judgmental eyebrows, but the idea of the folding desk, miniature field of order in a chaotic world, still lingers. You can find echoes of it in cafe tabletops, lap desks, travel notebooks, and camping mugs filled with hot tea while someone writes a postcard or journal entry beneath a tree. We still crave that little square of space where thought can unfold, slowly, one brushstroke at a time. And what of the scholar on the hill, sipping quietly, copying Confucius? What was he hoping to achieve? Maybe nothing. Maybe he just wanted to keep his desk clear, to keep his tea warm, to make his mind still, if only for a while. After the early morning reflections on a scholar's portable sanctum in the gentle hills of Hosa, The day slowly unfurls like a well-steeped tea. Now we drift further into the life of these quiet scholars alive, where every movement, every pause was an exercise in deliberate thought and measured breath. Imagine a narrow lane in a small provincial town, bathed in the mellow light of early afternoon. Here, a modest Hanok traditional Korean house sits peacefully, its wooden beams and paper windows softly rustling in the warm summer breeze. Within its low-slinged study, a scholar named Seong-jin resumes his work after a brief lull. He has already spent the morning polishing his folding desk and arranging his tea set with the care of one preparing a ritual. In this moment, every object in the room seems imbued with purpose. The inkstone smooth from years of use. The brush carefully cleaned and set beside a small pile of crisp paper. And the tea set arranged in a quiet symmetry that whispers of balance and propriety. That SEO NG Jin's desk is more than a mere toilet, is his portable world of order and contemplation. The desk, with its delicate joints and etched patterns, is a microcosm of the values he lives by. Each carefully folded leg, each measured edge, reflects the Confucian ideal that even the simplest aspects of life, when treated properly, can lead to moral refinement and inner calm. As he unfolds the desk for his afternoon study session, he pauses to trace the soft, worn grain of the wood, as if reading the history of countless quiet hours that have passed in the same gentle manner. Today, Seong-jin chooses to work on a commentary on the Analects, a text he has studied since his youth, but his task is not rushed. It is a slow unfolding of thought, as deliberate as the slow expansion of steam from a freshly poured cup of tea. Each line he copies is an act of meditation, each brushstroke an homage to the peaceful order of nature. His hand moves steadily, the brush dancing gently across the paper in patterns that have become familiar through repetition and quiet practice. Outside, the world moves at its own languid pace. A neighbor mends a small fence, and the soft clack of bamboo against wood joins the subdued chorus of daily life. Birds in the nearby pine grove sing intermittently background melody to the scholar's careful labor. Even the passing cloud, drifting slowly against the blue sky, seems to echo the measured rhythm of Seong-jin's work. In this slow procession of moments, there is time to think, time to savor each detail, and time to let the simple act of writing become a source of solace. The tea set plays an equally important role in this quiet symphony. Seong-jin's teapot, made of a humble clay that has absorbed years of gentle heat and careful cleaning, holds tea brewed from hand-picked leaves. Before each sip, he inspects the tea closely admiring the delicate swirl of steam and the subtle fragrance that rises from the cup. There is a deliberate ritual here, a graceful lifting of the cup, a measured sip, a thoughtful pause, and then a return to the work at hand. For Xiangjin, tea is not merely a beverage, it is a companion in the pursuit of balance and clarity. Its warmth permeates his very being, infusing his thoughts with a quiet assurance that steadies him against the day's uncertainties. Every so often, Xiangjin glances away from his work, his eyes softening as he takes in the room's gentle details, the play of light on paper, the whisper of wind through the eaves, the faint, rhythmic tick of an unseen clock marking the passage of a patient afternoon. His surroundings are modest, yet meticulously arranged, each item holding its own quiet significance. The small brush holder, the inkwell, even a dried flower pressed between pages all contribute to the overarching atmosphere of deliberate simplicity. During one such pause, Xiangjin reflects on the origin of his prized folding desk. He recalls old stories passed down among scholars' tales of a long-forgotten artisan who once crafted these portable desks with the belief that wisdom should never be bound by the walls of a study. Instead, they should accompany the scholar wherever the heart might lead, to a bustling market, a serene riverside, or even a remote mountaintop. That spirit of mobility and independence was cherished in Hosan, where the journey of learning was seen as an endless path that enriched both the mind and the soul. Even as Xiangjin contemplates the legacy of these carefully folded objects, he is mindful of the practical aspects of his life. The desk, though beautiful, is designed not only for reflection but also for function. Its compact form allows him to travel easily between villages, an important feature in a time when travel was both arduous and unpredictable. When he leaves his home for a visit to a friend or a scholarly exchange at a local Confucian academy, he carries his folding desk and tea set tucked securely in a well-worn parcel bag. In these moments, the desk transforms from a stationary table into a trusted companion, a portable repository of his cultivated self. This dual nature, the desk as both an intimate workspace and a travel companion, mirrors a deeper lesson of the Hasang spirit, that even in a world fraught with change and uncertainty, one can always find a place of quiet continuity. The scholar's desk is a reminder that no matter where life leads, there is always a space for reflection, always a moment to recalibrate and return to the center. It is in these careful, understated practices that the grand ideals of Confucian thought, harmony, respect, and measured progress are lived out in everyday acts. As the afternoon light shifts gradually toward the softer hues of early evening. Sunjin's study takes on an even more languid quality. The patterns of light and shadow on the paper seem to echo the gentle rise and fall of his breath. Outside, the faint rustle of leaves and the distant call of a nightingale blend together in a natural lullaby. In this quiet tableau, every object, folding desk, the tea set, the worn brush participates in a collective meditation on the nature of time, purpose, and the steady march of life in such moments. The scholar is not just an individual striving for academic excellence. He is a living embodiment of the broader cultural ethos, quiet affirmation that slow, thoughtful living is itself a virtue. The modest tools of his trade, far from being mere instruments of record-keeping, become symbols of resistance against the chaos of a rapidly changing world. They are a small but enduring testament to the belief that even the humblest of objects can hold profound meaning if treated with care and reverence throughout the day. Xiangjing continues his work with a measured cadence. His writing unfolds in deliberate loops and swirls, each character a quiet assertion of his inner order. With every stroke, he brings a little more clarity to the text stand, in turn to himself. The act of writing becomes a mirror reflecting not only the wisdom of ancient teachings, but also the gentle serenity of a life lived in quiet constancy. And as the final rays of sunlight begin to filter through the paper windows, Xiangjing sets down his brush with a soft sigh. He closes the pages he has worked on with the same slow deliberation that marked their creation, and carefully folds his desk back into its compact form. The tea set, having served its purpose for the day, is rinsed with cool water and placed in its designated spot. Silent promise that tomorrow will bring another day of calm reflection. In that moment of quiet culmination, as the scholar prepares to retire for the night, one cannot help but wonder, is it not remarkable how the simplest routines, the folding of a desk, the brewing of tea, the measured cadence of a single brushstroke can weave themselves into the fabric of a lifetime? Perhaps in the careful preservation of these small practices lies the true measure of wisdom in the calm that follows. Xiangjin lingers for a few more minutes, gazing at the now empty workspace. He reflects on how, even in the midst of life's inevitable uncertainties, there exists a sanctuary of order and beauty, a space where thoughts can bloom slowly and deliberately. And in that space, the humble folding desk and tea set stand as enduring symbols of a commitment to living with quiet purpose. As dusk folds itself gently over the tiled rooftops of Hosieonera, Korea, the lights within the hanok begin to soften. Paper lanterns glow like fireflies. Crickets begin their nightly concert, and in a small room warmed by years of ink, thought, and tea, a folded desk rests beside a bundle of brushes, as if sleeping. It is the end of the scholar's day, and yet, what may look like an ending, the final brushstroke, the last sip of tea, the folding away of the sobanese, in truth, part of a longer, slower rhythm, one that shaped not just individuals like Xiang Jin, but an entire society. The folding desk and the tea set were not accessories to this life. They were the life. And if we are to understand how these objects held meaning, we must look at how they lived beyond the quiet studies and peaceful courtyards into the world of civil service, public virtue, and the long exams that defined a man's path in Joseon, Korea. The state examination system, known as the Gwagyo, was the backbone of Kwa official life during the Joseon dynasty. It was grueling, hierarchical, deeply Confucian, and yet curiously poetic. A young man hoping to enter government service had to begin with years, sometimes decades, so study. His textbooks, the Analects, the Book of Mentius, the Classic of Rites, and the Book of Documents, all of which he had to memorize. Not simply understand, memorize. And so he needed tools that encouraged patience and presence. He needed a desk he could carry to his cousin's house, to a shady riverbank, or to a quiet corner of a market's rear courtyard. The Soban made it possible. It didn't demand a formal room or a fixed schedule. It was modest, light, unobtrusive, just like the ideal scholar himself. Candidates took their desks with them to study groups, public reading halls, and even examination sites. There are records from the late 15th century that describe hundreds of examinees seated in rows beneath temporary tents, each with a folding desk placed before them like a small wooden shield. Their tea sets, if present, were wrapped tightly in cloth to prevent spills. Some kept only a small thermos of warm water and a few dried leaves in a pouch tied at the waist. The image is almost comically precise. A sea of small desks, each barely large enough for a sheet of paper and an inkstone. Each man hunched in quiet anxiety, scratching brush to page with the hope of earning a title and, perhaps one day, a government post. Yet, despite the pressure, there was dignity in the process. Passing the Gwagyo wasn't just a matter of intelligence. It was proof of restraint, of endurance, of being the kind of person who could reflect before acting, who could sip tea while others argued, who could fold a desk and move along without complaint. The folding desk was not simply a tool for study, it was a rehearsal for life. In some cases, a Soban continued to follow a scholar long after he'd passed his exams. In regional offices, county magistrates, usually former scholars, were known to take their personal desks on inspection tours. A 17th century diary by a traveling official in Jela province describes how he would unfold his writing desk. Beneath a plum tree, pour 1 measure of brewed tea, and begin to write letters to the capital. He refers to the desk as his mobile virtue. In another anecdote, a scholar monk named Cho Young claimed his sobin was the only furniture he owned. Everything else, he wrote, is a luxury. But with a low table, I have a world. There is a subtle lesson in that phrase, that modesty applied consistently and with reverence can become an identity. Over time, the folding desk and tea set became wrapped into the broader artistic sensibilities of Korean life in poetry. They appear often but quietly. The kettle hisses as brush touches silk again. Again, the desk watches, saying nothing. In painting, the sobin sometimes takes center stage not with grandeur, but with intimacy. In one famous 18th century scroll by painter Shin Young-bak, a young scholar sits alone at a low table, writing by candlelight. The tea steam curls toward a window. Nothing happens, and yet everything does. That was the point. Even among the general public, the presence of a sobin became associated with introspection and calm. Grandmothers would joke that a boy who stared too long at his food tray was destined to be a scholar. Tea vendors marketed portable cups as fitting for men of letters, and rural schoolmasters often kept their old exam desks long after retirement scratched, slightly crooked but still in use. By the late Joseon period, folding desks had expanded in function. They were used for meals, for children's lessons, for ancestral rites, and sometimes as makeshift altars. But they never lost their scholarly associations. To sit at a sobin, even just for a meal, was to pause, to eat slowly, to arrange your bowl and spoon with care, to give attention to form dot. And isn't that the heart of Confucianism? That even the everyday perhaps especially the everyday can be sacred if done properly. In our own hurried world, it can be difficult to imagine carrying a desk with you. We prefer pockets and screens, collapsible everything, and thoughts that move faster than the speed of tea. But something about the soban lingers. Its very slowness feels like a protest, a kind one. It reminds us that not all movement is progress, that not all thought must be fast, that a portable desk and a cup of tea can be a complete world, if you allow it. And what of the scholars themselves, gentle, determined men who folded their desks, packed their brushes, and set out in pursuit of a passing grade and a meaningful life? Many never passed, Some passed and retired in obscurity. Some became officials. A few became poets. A handful wrote down things that are still read today. But most simply lived quietly, steadily, guided by the belief that wisdom wasn't something you discovered in a flash of brilliance, but something you cultivated like a garden, one character at a time. So perhaps tonight, you too might find a moment to reflect. You may not have a Sobin by your side, but perhaps there's a small table nearby, a cup of something warm, a quiet space to think, and in that, the spirit of the scholar still lives folded neatly into your evening, waiting patiently to be opened.